gluten sensitivity is not a disease. This may be blowing your mind right now, and maybe it's not. Hopefully it's not. If you've read No Grain, No Pain, I know it's not blowing your mind, but gluten sensitivity is not a disease. Drowning. Is drowning a disease? No. Drowning is an example of taking your body, putting it underwater, and asking it to do something it's not designed to do, right? Drowning is genetic. You don't have gills, so therefore you're not going to go underwater and grow gills magically and start breathing oxygen out of the water. So gluten sensitivity is not a disease. It's a state of genetics. You either have the genes or you don't. And if you've had genetic testing done, and it sounds like some of you talking tonight did, you have to make sure you've had the right genetic testing done, because so many of you get the wrong genetic testing. We're looking not for HLQ genes, we're looking for HLA-DQ genes. And there's two of them. There's an alpha 1 and there's a beta 1 gene. So and what happens a lot of times in celiac disease, when they run these celiac panels looking for the genes, they're looking for subtypes of these genes called HLA-DQ8 or HLA-DQ2. But I want you to understand that 8s and 2s are associated with celiac disease, meaning if you have HLA-DQ8 or 2, then the likelihood that you can develop celiac disease is much higher, okay? But it doesn't mean that you're not gluten sensitive. You can have an HLA-DQ1 or an HLA-DQ3 gene pattern, and all of these 4 patterns are gluten sensitive patterns. So if you have these patterns, but you haven't had all these patterns looked for, you may be gluten sensitive and not know it because you haven't had the proper genetic testing. You've only had half of the genetic testing done, which again is what a lot of people, when they go to the GI doctors oftentimes will only look for 2 or 8 and won't look for 1 or 3. The lab company 23andMe that does the genetic profiles, they only look at 2s and 8s, they don't look at 1s and 3s. So you can be a negative for 2 or 8 but a positive for 1 or 3 and be gluten sensitive. And that's a big part of the problem for many people, is that they don't know that they have these particular gene patterns, and so they've been told you're not celiac, you're not going to develop celiac disease, keep on eating gluten. Why? Why? Because doctors oftentimes will call gluten sensitivity and celiac disease, and they'll use them interchangeably. In essence, they'll say, oh, celiac disease, aka gluten sensitivity. No, they're not the same thing. Just what I said earlier, everyone with celiac disease is gluten sensitive, but not everybody with gluten sensitivity is going to develop celiac disease. And many people with gluten sensitivity will develop things like RA. We've seen cases of multiple sclerosis, Hashimoto's, multiple skin diseases like dermatitis herpetiformis and vitiligo and psoriasis and eczema. So again, we could draw out lots of different arrows from gluten sensitivity, and the reason why gluten sensitivity is not a disease, it's a state of genetics. But if you have the genes for gluten sensitivity, how do we activate them? This was one of the questions that prompted the show tonight. How do you activate the genes for gluten sensitivity if you have them? How do you activate them? You eat gluten. You turn them on. Naturally, these genes will produce an inflammatory response against gluten when they're exposed to gluten. So you activate that inflammatory response that leads to these types of diseases by getting exposure. So you turn the genes on because these genes are actually protective. They don't want you to eat gluten, and they're trying to tell you not to eat gluten by creating an inflammatory response in your body and hoping that you'll listen. So when you eat gluten, you activate these HLA-DQ genes, and those HLA-DQ genes lead to an outcome that is inflammatory in nature, and oftentimes that inflammation builds over time and creates autoimmune disease. So somebody asked, I got diagnosed when I was 43 earlier. Why didn't I get diagnosed? If I've always been gluten sensitive and this is truly genetic, why didn't I get diagnosed when I was 2 or 3 or 10 or 15? Because just because you're gluten sensitive doesn't mean that you're sick tomorrow as a result of that gluten sensitivity. If you have these genes, it becomes an issue of input over time. The more input, the more gluten, the more pizza, the more beer, the more pasta, the more spaghetti, whatever it is that you're gluten-based poison, the more input that you have, the more inflammation over time is created. The more inflammation over time is created, the less and less your body is capable of dealing with it as time goes on. Remember, all disease that's inflammatory in nature doesn't happen because of one minor incidence of inflammation. Our bodies are adaptive and resilient. They will adapt and be as resilient as they can be until they can't be. And it's that point of no return. It's that when your body no longer has the capacity to continue to allow the onslaught of damage coming in, that's the fundamental breaking point. That's when the organ reserve goes into the toilet. That's when the gut breaks down. That's when the skin becomes inflamed. That's when the liver goes into autoimmune state. So it's the chronic exposure over time that leads to the body's inability to continue to adapt to the damage. Let me give you an analogy that might kind of make this make better sense for you. If you've ever played that game in school, we played this game in school, it's called Knuckles, right? Where you just tapped each other's knuckles, you taking turns, right? And the first 50 times or so, no big deal. Your knuckles and your fingers were just fine, but you kept going and you kept going until somebody gave up. And what ended up happening, if you had a strong will, is the other guy's knuckles got super big and swollen and red and started getting bloody, and so did yours, right? And that's my point, is it's the repetitive damage. You can take a few hits, you can take a lot of hits, but that damage builds up, and when it builds up enough and the skin finally breaks and the blood starts coming out, now you kind of realize maybe it's time to quit playing this ludicrous game. And that's what I would say about this. When you are getting that damage, that constant, consistent exposure over time, your genes are responding appropriately by creating an inflammatory response to try to deal with this. And when the gluten finally breaks you down to the point where your body can no longer work or tolerate it, that's when your knuckle starts to bleed. That's when it's time to say, I need to look at this a little bit more seriously. Probably should get some genetic testing to get some clarity as to whether or not the gluten-free diet is absolutely the right diet to follow for the rest of your life. Because remember what we said at the beginning of the show, gluten sensitivity is not the same thing as an intolerance, and it's not the same thing as an allergy. So most doctors, when they're testing for gluten sensitivity, they don't test genetics. They test for intolerance, or they test for acute or delayed allergy. And it's not the same thing. And if you're running these types of tests and you have no clue, no idea whether or not you're truly gluten sensitive. So those of you who are on the fence, you're not quite sure, you've had some testing, but you didn't get genetic testing done. Genetic testing is how you would identify whether or not the gluten-free diet is the right move for you to make, because this will not go away. This is ingrained in the genetics, ingrained, pun intended. It's ingrained in the genetics. It doesn't go away. You can't cure it. It's not a disease. It's not something that needs to be cured. It's something that needs to be recognized and honored, and it's something that you need to appropriate your diet around so that you can become healthy, as opposed to continued bombardment on your genetics. Putting your genes in an environment that's not conducive to their survival is basically, it's food programmed suicide or food programmed deterioration of health, and you don't want that. So that's the breakdown. You cannot heal from a gluten sensitivity. It is genetic, and you can't change your genes, at least not yet. And we may come upon a point where you can. I still won't recommend that you do, because that's a whole can of worms we'll talk about on another day. Hey, and if you missed the earlier part of this series, click right here so you can go back and get caught up. The information there might be critical to helping you on your path to better health. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe for updates below. Have a great day.